Tjerk Ruimschotel is author of an excellent London guide about housing called 20th Century Housing Projects. It's helpfully bookended with some 19th century and also 21st century developments. Tjerk is a Dutchman, a lecturer and urban designer, and was formerly chief urban designer at the city of Groningen. He is clearly a regular visitor to the capital and has 2 English sons-in-law. So, Tjerk, what was it that prompted you to write this book beyond an excuse to visit your grandchildren in London?
Well, Peter, it was much like London's urban development itself, sort of more by accident than by design, that I came to write this guide. I was organizing a trip to London in 2015 for the Design Council of Groningen. And then, of course, I read a lot of books, including some guides on London architecture, but I was somewhat annoyed about the lack of precision on the location, the measurements, or the contents of the projects. And the selection was not always to my taste or preference, too much churches and too much offices. And then it seemed that a German publisher in Berlin, who had a very nice collection of guides, didn't have one on London. And when I checked him if that was the case, he said, "Yes, we don't have a guide on London. Would you write one for me?" And I'm a sucker saying no. So I thought, well, maybe I can do that. But then, as an urban designer and sometime part-time citizen of London, I was more interested in the residential environments of London and its boroughs. So I said to this publisher, "I'll do it, but then only I'll confine myself to housing." And that was okay. So that's how it started.
Very good. So you visited every scheme, which I must say is more than I have. And although now, of course, I've got no excuse, because your book has a lot of excellent maps and QR codes to help your readers get to places. But how did you actually carry out the research generally?
Well, I'm sorry, but research is a big word for what I did. Most of my work was buying books, like the ones you see here, reading them, of course, and drafting up lists, lots of lists. And I started, of course, with the guides of Jones and Woodward. I also wanted to visit or revisit the projects we studied when we were students in the 60s and the 70s. And later on, as a professional, we visited London in the 80s and 90s. And I wanted to see those classic icons like the Barbican, the Golden Lane, Robin Hood, and everything done by Neve Brown or Lubetkin or Goldfinger. But then I noticed there was hardly anything on housing. First, I was looking at the internet, and then I saw a lot of contemporary houses, which I thought was very nice to collect. But being an outsider, I didn't quite understand the context of the current housing situation in London. So I started to study more on the history of housing of London, and that became more of a focus in my work. Well, then I checked Wikipedia, of course. Well, I traveled quite a bit around London, and it helped that my daughter was living in Beckenham, so I could avoid the north of the Thames bias I sometimes found in the information I was collecting. And from the one thing came to the other. So my research, if you would like to call it, was more of a mix of, methodically drafting up lists and stumbling simply through information and going on taking everything not at face value, But well, I have an eclectic taste, so I try to collect so much that at sometimes I had more than 400 projects on my long list. So I had to travel quite a while and a lot to see them in the flesh, so to speak, and to check their spatial qualities.
I must say, I think it's an excellent selection. I kept asking myself going through the book, I wonder if he's got this one in. And of course, I turned over the page and there it was. And so what were the sort of main characteristics of a project that made sure it got into your top list, your published list?
When I started in 2016, I thought it would be easy to get an exemplary number of projects, like the first one or the best one or the biggest one, the most successful one, the most innovative or experimental. But then I realized that all my sources of information were from a particular perspective, or were dealing with a confined subject. So there was nothing to build upon. Even the RIBA book on British housing left out projects I thought were very interesting, without much of an explanation. So I figured myself that I had to find the common factor for all the projects I sort of selected already. And well, maybe because I'm an urban designer, but then I found that the main similarity between all the projects I selected was the contributions the project made to the spatial quality of the surroundings. So more than just the building or the estate itself. And to make it to the list, the architects of the projects I selected not only had to provide a good home for the residents, but they also had to be, well, they had to turn the idea of collective housing into something in which, you say the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And some of the larger projects thus could become a residential environment on their own, with urban qualities that the mere repetition of buildings or dwellings could never achieve. And the final selection, I realized later on, was based on the role that the information I got of the project and the architect, the client, could play in the storyline I wanted the guide to have. And it was not something I thought of first, but it came working on the guide, and that is the continuing drive to create something of architectural value, both for the resident and the society alike.
I mean, I know it's not as extensive as Mutasius's Das Englische Haus, but it is really interesting to have an outsider commenting on, in this case, London housing. And I think particularly one from Holland, of course, which is often seen as a country that's delivered contemporary housing more successfully in many cases than Britain. So what are your thoughts about the general aspect of the sort of quality of the new housing which you saw in London?
Well, Peter, in my last chapter, I included 14 projects by 13 architects. And I could have doubled that or tripled it, but in the context of the book, I thought that was sufficient. But well, I know that at least half of the architects in my guide are working on an impressive portfolio of successful housing projects, and I see new and old clients, even some boroughs, who give these architects a chance, and the RBA Award and the NLA Awards approve of that. And well, I see that among younger architects, there's a growing interest in design of housing. A lot of your and our star architects never did much housing. And I think the growing interest in the history and future of housing is a good thing, especially in London, the unique residential city.
It was very interesting because I live in Bedford Park, which you featured as one of the 19th century developments, and I developed a logbook for every house. And as a little test, I noticed that you'd actually mentioned the logbook. So I was pleased to see that, but it showed you'd really done your homework. So Tjerk, thank you very much indeed for your insights into London housing, and a fascinating book, but it's going to be really important for both students of architecture in London, but visitors to the city as well. So thank you.
Thank you.